In his manifesto, Ted Kaczynski states that many left-wing and liberal activist groups are over-socialized and have feelings of inferiority. Is there any truth to this? You are putting together a huge range of people with very different politics and asking if they all share a widespread human trait. Your question is really too broad to be the kind of question a social scientist would try to answer, and even if it was answerable, it wouldn't tell us much. Over-socialized is a concept Kaczynski made up. It is not a sociology or general social science concept. Without being operationalized, defined very clearly in a way that was empirically measurable, the concept can't be studied. Self-esteem is a concept that has been widely studied. The problem is it is also not well operationalized across disciplines. So for example, while psychologists have developed decent scales for measuring it, I am not sure political scientists use those scales or use them appropriately. For example, here is an article from the Journal of Political Psychology that is supposedly comparing the political ideologies of narcissists and people with low self-esteem. But then they add a caveat that they are not defining narcissism in clinical terms. They are defining it as having a grandiose self-image, not as having high self-esteem. But in clinical psychology, narcissism is defined as based on very low self-esteem. That is what produces a grandiose self-image. So what exactly is this political science article measuring? I don't know, and honestly I am not sure they do either. You can review the political science literature on self-esteem and politics and get as many answers as there are articles. Here is an article arguing that high self-esteem predicts high political engagement but not political position. Here is one arguing that low self-esteem predicts hatred of outgroups. Here is one arguing that structural factors may explain political involvement more than internal ones. So, while you could probably cherry-pick articles to support the argument Kaczynski makes, there is no wealth of studies to support it. The definition of self-esteem itself as relatively enduring is also up for debate, so it may not be a valid measure in and of itself. Over-socialized is a concept Kaczynski made up. It is not a sociology or general social science concept. Not for nothing, but there is a famous paper in sociological social psychology titled, The Over-Socialized Concept of Man in Modern Society. PDF. In that paper, Dennis Wrong argues that social theory unrealistically assumes individuals are influenced by little more than processes of social control. That is, Wrong criticizes contemporary social theory for treating the concept of an individual as if it is totally reducible to processes of social influence. That idea seems pretty similar to what Kaczynski was arguing, though Kaczynski presents it in a more reified way, at least as his arguments are portrayed here. No idea if Kaczynski was influenced by Wrong, but the concept did exist prior to his writing. Edit to add. Now that I think about more, Kaczynski probably wasn't influenced by Wrong because Wrong's argument directly criticizes Kaczynski's. Still, the concept did exist in sociology prior to Kaczynski's contributions to social philosophy. I've been liberal all my life and an outspoken everything since back in the 90s, and it never once made me feel inferior. The whole point of feminism is that women don't need to feel inferior automatically, for any reason, because social structures are fucking bunk and you shouldn't let that shit do that to you. If you're learning about the hardships that other people go through due to the specific social histories and patterns that we have had baked into the world and coming out the other end feeling personally inferior in some way, then you are frankly doing it wrong. There's a big difference between acknowledging mentally and openly that certain people have had to jump through certain hoops and overcome certain disadvantages as basic facts, and to also look at how those things would then ripple forward in the future and go, wow, that sucks, and that is unfair and unjust. It shouldn't be that way. It makes sense how X, Y, and Z might be more difficult for you, I get that now, or something to that general effect. It's not going to kill you to acknowledge that maybe, in broad strokes, there are things that are just unfair in the world, like how black people were enslaved and then had to fight for civil rights, or women having to fight for their ability to own property and vote, etc. These are just historic facts that should inform you on perhaps some hardships that maybe otherwise held back the reputation of a certain group. E.g., how so many young men are so quick to say women never contributed anything to society, or very little to it, without stopping to think, gee, did women really not contribute anything to society, or were their contributions simply ignored/taken credit for by men, given that there are many historical and well-known instances of that happening, and women being literally not allowed to participate in so many fields through so many junctions in history, how could I expect their historical contributions when as written by men for so long and the only real participants that were heartily encouraged or even allowed to participate were meant to be equal to men, when it stands to reason that their contributions wouldn't be accurately reflected in what we've generally come to accept as history? Especially given that we often revise and update history with new information as it's revealed, and perhaps the general sexism of the last few decades just might also be coloring my judgment. Maybe I was a bit hasty in agreeing with that statement, and I should revisit it. Like, you don't have to hate yourself, you just have to maybe reflect a little and think about how someone's particular hardships might have generally impacted their life. It's basic human empathy. It's got zero to do with self-hate, because it's got zero to do with you on a personal level. It's all about systems and historical injustice that can be righted with altering mindsets and attitudes for a more inclusive future that lets everyone thrive. Honestly, it sounds like typical right-wing projection. The well-educated, tolerant people who live in big cities and earn more money must obviously hate themselves, because if they don't, that shatters my entire worldview that liberals are bad and wrong. Honestly, it sounds like typical right-wing projection. The well-educated, tolerant people who live in big cities and earn more money must obviously hate themselves, because if they don't, that shatters my entire worldview that liberals are bad and wrong. As an anarchist and a communist, I must say his views on leftists are obscure and unfounded. At the same time, I have to take with a grain of salt he was experimented on by the OSS with large amounts of LSD during the height of the Cold War. So they probably put a lot of ideas into his head about leftists too. I can't imagine anyone living alone too long in cabin in the woods or anywhere doesn't have a little bit of self-esteem problems, but to make blanket statements like this about large groups of people is usually never the case. To my knowledge, there has never been a study done to conclude the data he claimed. Even if there was, what would keep people from lying if medical records are private? Or would the sample size of the people asked even really represent a true number? So even if you find such a study, are the statistics valid? US Republican and Democrats both slant the data in their favor at times, so take that what you will. Ted Kaczynski was an intensely disturbed individual with a general lack of empathy. Anything he wrote was in justification of killing people. He just used lots of intelligent-sounding words that sound rational, yet his whole argument becomes disentangled in the execution of his vision. He doesn't reflect the general attitudes of liberals or conservatives, and there's no solid empirical basis to substantiate any of his claims. He was an radicalized extremist who put the value of human life secondary to his distorted worldview. He was a ranting anarchist madman who likely experienced a lot of traumas in his lifetime.